Hello, I'm Helen, and I want to tell you about the time I got revenge on my high school bully after graduation. My bullying situation was similar to most. I would be picked on daily, and no matter what I did to avoid them, they would always find a way to make my life miserable. Whether that would be from calling me bad names, embarrassing me in front of all of my peers, forcing me to run their errands for them, or pretty much anything else they could conjure up, you name it, they made me do it. The worst part was that I couldn't even go to my teachers for help because my bully was actually my teacher. Miss Smith was very popular with both the staff and the students, so whenever I tried to complain, I was the one who looked like the bad guy. She was polite to everyone else, smiling all the time, helpful to the students, and assisted other teachers with their classes. Miss Smith, or Sydney, to everyone but me, had the whole school wrapped around her little finger. "How could you say such a thing about Sydney?" was the usual response I would get from other students, and the principal wasn't any better. Whenever I went to him for help, he would tell me, "We've never received a complaint before. Maybe you're just misunderstanding her." I wasn't misunderstanding anything, and he would just make matters worse after my complaints. Whenever he would go talk to her, he would always walk away charmed, and I would be punished later. Officially, I was her assistant, a title she gave to me after my last complaint didn't work. Unofficially, though, I was her servant. She would make me pick up the class worksheets, and I would be the one filling them out. If I made a mistake, she would yell at me, cursing and throwing the papers onto the ground. Then I would have to pick them up and start all over again. At one point in time, I tried ignoring her, but she started failing me on purpose, putting Fs on all of my tests. I also tried to comply with what she wanted, but she would yell and scream that it was never good enough. It got so bad that every time I heard my name, I would flinch in fear of what she would want me to do next. And when she saw that, her face would delight in my fear. She was so admired by everyone that I started to believe that the whole school was out to get me. I was constantly tormented. It felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. So when graduation came around, I was overjoyed. It was finally an end to all of the suffering that I had put up with throughout high school. And now I could move on. However, I could feel something bubbling up inside of me as I sat and waited for my name to be called on graduation day. When the principal called my name, I cowered in my seat, looking around to see where she was. Graduation was supposed to be an incredible time for me, but Miss Smith still had her claws inside my brain. Her control was forever hanging heavy over my head. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I knew that as long as I continued to let her have power over me, I would never be able to live my life happily. So, knowing that she wouldn't be able to do anything to me anymore, I decided to get my revenge. After graduation, I went to the nearest store and bought many Bluetooth-activated palm-sized alarms. On many different occasions, she'd had me run personal errands for her, so I knew where she lived. And I also knew that she had a spare key hidden behind her back door. I waited for her and her husband to leave the house and snuck inside. I hid the alarms all over her home. Upstairs, downstairs, in the bedroom, in the kitchen. I didn't miss a spot. That night, all I had to do was sit back and wait for them to go to sleep. I parked not far from their house to watch it all unfold and waited for the last light in the house to go out. I pulled up the app on my cell phone and turned on the first alarm. I waited and laughed for 5 minutes until the signal turned off on their end. Only 5 minutes had passed from start to finish, but it was the best 5 minutes of my life. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in what felt like years. It was like I was getting my life back for once. She was no longer in control. Night after night, I watched as their sleep was interrupted. The lights going off, then coming back on, the sensor on my app telling me that it was finally disabled after minutes of them searching. All of this made each night worthwhile and resulted in a fair amount of hysterical laughter from me. It was so satisfying to be able to get revenge on Miss Smith after everything she'd put me through. One morning, I was so curious about how they were handling the situation that I decided to go and check out my handiwork. I set off one of the alarms early, the one I'd placed in the kitchen, and snuck around the back to peek through the window to get a better view of their faces when they turned it off. A minute passed before Miss Smith stormed into the kitchen and yanked open the cabinets. She searched a little before she pulled out the alarm and smashed her hand on top of the button, turning it off. It was hard for me to contain my laughter, but seeing the irritation on her face and how many times she slammed her hand on the button over and over again, even after the alarm turned off, well, I couldn't help but smile. Not only was my plan working, but it was working better than I could have ever hoped for. I wanted to stand up in full view of the window and show my face to Miss Smith to let her know that it had been me all along. I wanted nothing more than to bask in her shock as she saw my face standing before her with the alarm still in her hand. But instead, I turned away from the window and pulled out my phone. Everything was going so smoothly, so I decided to turn on another alarm. If she was irritated now, I could just imagine how annoyed she'd be by hearing another alarm go off. The thought of seeing her flinch like I did all those times when she called my name filled me with joy. However, when I was about to press the button, I heard mumbling coming from inside. When I looked back through the window, I saw Miss Smith crying. At first, I didn't care. I mean, after all of the things she'd done to me, it was only right that she experienced a little bit of the pain that I'd undergone for so long. But then her husband came downstairs. He started yelling and screaming at her, telling her that this was all her fault. He blamed her for everything and even went as far as to accuse her of setting the alarms herself. She denied it, and they started to argue, but he wouldn't back down. I could hear him screaming things at her that she used to say to me. "How could you be so stupid? You know I have to work early in the morning, and now you're playing these ridiculous games? You're worthless. There'll be trouble if you don't find every single alarm before I get back today." He physically pushed past her as he stormed out of the house. Then he got into his car and drove away. I was shocked. I actually felt sorry for her and was about to leave. But that's when I heard another voice shouting. This time, it was a woman. I looked inside the window, and an old woman was standing there screaming at Miss Smith. Her voice was so loud and annoying.
"You will never be the wife my son deserves!"
she screamed.
"Both of us are miserable because of you! Get the hint already, and leave us to live in peace!"
I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The old woman looked absolutely terrifying. Miss Smith paused for a moment and then shouted, "Helen!" I froze. My whole body went completely numb. She'd seen me. But that's when she continued talking. "Just because you're my mother-in-law doesn't mean you can speak to me like that in my own house." Oh, whoa. Her mother-in-law had exactly the same name as me. At that moment, things started to make sense. After everything that Miss Smith had put me through, it was hard for me to feel sympathy for her. But now I was able to see everything with my own eyes. She was doing to me the things that had been done to her. I guess it was her way of getting some kind of release. I had always wondered why it was me that she decided to pick on, but it was obvious now. I felt sorry for what she was going through, but I was also angry that she had taken her frustrations out on me for so many years. After thinking about it, I realized I didn't want to be like her. She was miserable and had decided to make someone else's life miserable too, just so she could feel a bit better. That just wasn't in my nature, and I didn't want to end up like her. Two wrongs don't make a right. So I wrote a letter giving the location of the rest of the alarms and slipped it under her door. After I was done, I drove away from her house and never looked back. Have you ever been picked on by your teacher?
Hi, I'm Miley, and I have always wanted to go abroad. Every year my family stays in our caravan, which is okay, but it gets a bit boring as there's not much to do. I was desperate to travel to another country where they speak a different language and eat different food. I love learning about new places and geography at school and imagining what it would be like to see the mountains or the desert. I decided to save up money for a whole year, and for my birthday, I asked if people would give me money to help me fund my trip. Then I booked my flights, and in a month, I was ready to go. It did not go according to my plan. I didn't expect the airport to be so busy or confusing. I spent ages queuing in the wrong line and had to ask for directions to find the security gate. I beeped when I walked through the scanner, so then I had to be poked and prodded until the security guards were happy that I was safe. But I'd forgotten to take some of the things out of my rucksack, so they confiscated my sunscreen, makeup bag, scissors, and sewing kit. I felt so upset that I was delighted to find so many shops on the other side where I could replace my makeup. An hour later, I heard a voice announcing, "Could Miley Lewis please proceed to Gate 7, as she is about to miss her flight?" That was me! In a panic, I sprinted to the gate, losing my scarf on the way, and made it only just in time, exhausted. I was a bit nervous about the flight, but tried to push the horror stories of planes falling out of the sky out of my mind by putting on some music. But the stewardess told me that it had to be turned off for takeoff. I'd shut my book in the overhead locker, so I just had to sit and grip the arms of my chair as we took off, and I felt my ears pop. When we finally landed, I could have kissed the floor. I was so happy to be alive. The flight had been very bumpy, so I wasn't the only person to have been sick. Getting through passport control took ages, but finally, I was on the bus to my hotel. The man sitting next to me seemed friendly and kept chatting to me. When I went to the bathroom, he offered to watch my things. But when I came back, he had gone, and so had my purse. I couldn't believe that I'd been stupid enough to trust him, and that he'd stolen from me. Luckily, I still had my card. The bus pulled up next to a huge glass door. It looked so fancy, and I finally thought my day was looking up. But when I got off, I realized that my hotel was the one next to the big one, a small dingy building with peeling paint. It was so hot outside though, so I was just looking forward to getting out of the sun. I got some lunch in the hotel restaurant. I was served some kind of stew, which was actually quite tasty. I wondered what was in it. I was just eating the last few chunks from the bottom when I fished out a round thing with my spoon. It was a sheep eyeball. I ran out of the room and threw up in a potted plant. I spent the afternoon by the hotel pool, which was green and smelled a bit like sewage. But I thought I would just sit by the side of it and at least get a tan. I was just drifting off to sleep on a deck chair when I felt something tickling my leg. It was a huge insect. I screamed and kicked it off, but this caused my deck chair to snap, and I fell off of it into the disgusting pool water. I decided just to go to bed. In my room, I lay on my back on the grubby bed sheets, listening to the sounds of trees moving in the wind outside. I suddenly realized that there were no trees outside, so the noise I'd been hearing was a scuttling. Sure enough, an army of cockroaches ran across the floor by my shoes. That was just still the first day, and I couldn't take it anymore. The cockroaches incident was definitely the final straw. I gathered my things and got back on the first bus and plane I could book. I had to wait 28 hours in the airport, but that was much better than staying in that room. I think my family felt sorry for me that I had such a horrible experience abroad. But although I wasn't going to go again for a long time, I never complained about going camping again.